Welcome to Cut the Crop, keeping you in the know about everything you grow. Researchers, growers and other interesting folk delivering insights and information on topics ranging from agronomy to profitability. Brought to you by the Foundation for Arable Research.
Hello and welcome. My name's Alison Stewart and I'm your host of this session of Cut the Crop. And today we've got two farm researchers. We've got Joe Drummond and Richard Chynoweth. And so we're going to talk about, I guess, planning crop inputs when budgets are tight, because this coming season is not going to be easy for arable farmers. We know that input costs have gone up. We know that, some of the contract prices have gone down. I mean, last year we were getting $650, dollars per tonne for milling wheat, and the contracts are only about $500 this year. And we know that the dairy forecast milk price is pretty low, such that a lot of dairy farmers aren't even going to break even. And that's going to have a fairly negative, quite significant negative impact on arable growers, since we put most of our feed, grain and silage into the livestock sector. So it's about, I guess, tightening our belts and looking to see what we can do to get through this season and maintain our yields as best we can. So I guess, what can growers do to maintain their yields but cut their costs? And we're going to sort of look at cereals and we're going to look at some of the seed crops. So maybe start off with you, Richard.
Well, I think it's not a year to skimp on monitoring, and so monitor would be my key thing for a lot of the different inputs, especially nitrogen and irrigation inputs. So, like, irrigation-wise, there's always lots of questions of when to start, what happens if it rains during the season, how long do you stop for, those sort of things that soil moisture monitoring can actually help you with, make good decisions. And then at the end of the season, same thing, like monitor as to when to stop irrigating. So that's not necessarily a season to skimp on those some of those costs, because that can actually save you one irrigation, which can add up to a substantial amount of money, while not impacting on the bottom line. So to me, a lot of it, and fungicide input, all those things, be monitor for what's there.
Joe,
I'd agree with that completely. It's about, this is the season to know what you're dealing with. And that does mean you're going to have to monitor, whether it's monitoring your aphid numbers or your beneficial insects when you're considering making an insecticide decision, whether it's monitoring your weather conditions and monitoring what's happening in terms of your disease pressure. Knowing some of those things in terms of those types of pesticide inputs is going to be really important, because that may allow you to take your foot off the pedal a little bit. In terms of how you're going to use fertilizer, it's really important to know what's under your boots. And we can use that information to help us have more confidence in cutting back if we need to.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that big take-home message is, don't think that the easy option is just not to put, sort of more fertilizer or pesticide on, because you might save on that one spray. But if you've got a major reduction in your yield, the overall outcome is that you've lost money. And the only way that you can know how to, how much you should be putting on and when you should be putting on, is to monitor. So it's a year to be out there in your paddocks, making sure you know exactly what's going on.
Oh, absolutely. When tightening your belt, you have to have your finger on the pulse.
Yeah. So let's talk through about some specific things that growers can do. So, Richard, some words of wisdom?
Well, in terms of the grass seed space, getting closing date right for Italian ryegrass, that's one of the major drivers of seed yield. So it's not a year to skimp on or close early, and which induces more lodging. And actually, an Italian ryegrass reduces the number of seed heads. So it's actually really important that growers try and get their closing dates right on Italian ryegrass. And if you're going to reduce anything on, well, both types or all types of ryegrass, then cutting back on nitrogen rates the first place to look at seriously whether you need to spend that extra 20 kilos of N, because it's only going to cost you sort of 1% seed yield, and in many scenarios it'll still be just as high yielding as applying 180 kilos of N. So getting the closing date right in Italian ryegrass is key, and then getting the PGR rate right in perennial ryegrass is key. So in all the systems type trials we've done, if you're going to save money, it would be on nitrogen, and make sure you get good performance out of the seed heads that you get. So nitrogen, we need it for a green canopy. We need it for a certain number of seed heads, but we need to then make sure those seed heads perform properly by keeping them standing, keeping them clean. You might be able to look at saving a little bit on fungicides, but you need to be out there monitoring, seeing whether it's a stem rust season or not. And we don't know. It's still too early in the year to know whether stem rust will be an issue in grass seed crops. We'll know that come sort of November, and we'll be able to make some calls at that point. But for those growing turf type ryegrasses, it's just you got to work out that it's a standard year, and stem rust will be a problem.
Yeah, and we'll come back to the nitrogen issue in a minute. But Joe, in the cereal space?
So actually, your inputs may well have been determined when you put that crop in the ground in terms of your pesticides and the types of pressure that you might be under now. So depending on what your cultivar is and its resistance rating is going to determine quite a lot in terms of where you might be able to make some savings in that fungicide space, and also in terms of your insecticides. So in the insecticide space, typically once we reach growth stage 31, we should be past the point of having issues with YDV, so yellow dwarf virus. And it's really important that we consider all of the things around us. So our weather is going to play a pretty major role in terms of the amount of pressure we're under, both in terms of insect pressure and in terms of disease pressure. We talked a little bit in another podcast, which you can listen to, about the costs associated with implementing resistance management programs in cereal fungicides. So for us, it's going to be really important to rationalise out each timing and think about the value each of those applications is going to give us. And if we're in the early part of the season and we have a reasonably tolerant cultivar and we haven't got high disease pressure, do we really need to put ourselves and our chemistry under pressure to apply a fungicide at T0? And it's a really important question, because the days of having a cheap and cheerful T0 growth stage 30 application are probably in the past.
Yeah. So what about insecticides?
So insecticides, it can be tempting to chuck something in the tank when you're going through with a PGR and a herbicide. In terms of what we need to think about, what is our aphid population doing? What is our beneficial population doing? Because the beneficials will do a pretty good job for you if you've got a reasonable population there. What's our weather doing? So if we have a southerly come through, that's really good at getting rid of soft-bodied aphids. So we may be in a position where we may not need to apply one. And if we are going to apply one, we need to make sure that we're choosing something that's going to allow those beneficials to keep doing their job, because they will be doing a job if they're there.
So I think coming back to the comment that Richard made, I mean, nitrogen is obviously across all the arable crops, sort of one of the more costly inputs. Yeah. And so what's the recommendation then for growers to be able to optimize the efficiency of their nitrogen and know that they're putting on the right amount to be able to drive that yield, but they're not wasting any nitrogen? So maybe start with you, Richard.
Yeah, I think they've got to try and realise that the response curve is really flat at the top of all the response trials that we do. So actually targeting biological optimum, so to speak, actually costs you money. And so the economic optimum is somewhere before biological optimum. And Joe's got some numbers in for cereals, and I'm trying to think what it is for ryegrass, but it's around about 20 kilos less than the biological optimum. So we've talked for a number of years of 175 kilos of N for perennial ryegrass seed crops. The biological optimum is somewhere close to 200 kilos. And so being closer to that economic optimum, but that then also subtracting the soil mineral N from that, because that's part of the nitrogen that's available for the crop. So actually knowing what that number is quite important. But also I would suggest a mineral end test at closing actually would be just as beneficial to understand that as it was back in August, because you've actually applied some nitrogen and it'll be cycling through the system. So that's perennial ryegrass. Italian ryegrasses don't need as much N as perennials, so we're more talking about 150 to 160 kilos of total N for Italians, and it's knowing what's economic, because the cost of that extra N isn't necessarily paying for itself in terms of increased output.
Yeah, and what about in the cereal situation?
It's actually much the same in a cereal situation. Again, those response curves are really, really flat at the top, and it is really tempting to go for that total biological optimum. So in a feed wheat, that biological optimum sits around the sort of 315 kilos as total biological optimum. And if we think about where we're getting the best bang for our buck, it actually sits back at about 286 kilos. So it's
286.32.
Not quite that precise. But basically what that tells us is that we actually have some wiggle room. And this is based over a number of trials run over a number of seasons across a number of different environments. So what that tells us is that we probably do have a little bit more wiggle room than what we think in terms of where we target our program. So the wisdom that we've had over the years is that for a feed wheat, we need to sit somewhere between 250 and 300 for our total kind of optimum level. And that sits about right in terms of where our economic sweet spot is. And what Richard pointed out is that if we do go over that economic sweet spot, we are actually losing money on it. So that again, that extra 100 kilos that seems like a really good idea, it isn't making you the money that it would if you stuck with that economic optimum. And in terms of where you make that change is also going to be really important. So for a number of us, we've probably put on our first, we might have put on sulfate of ammonia or urea just in that early part of the spring. That's not the time to be making the saving on that space, because we need to be getting into that steep part of the growth curve. Where we have our wiggle room is perhaps later in the season around flag leaf timing, and again, perhaps later where we might be targeting protein. And that's where some of the other tools that we have in place, like the quick nitrate test, might be able to help us with some of those decisions.
Yeah.
And for those of us who are using leaf testers, and for those of us who are following Andrew and Amy Darling's Pathfinder Farm, those are some of the decisions that they're making to try and help them really find that sweet spot.
So you mentioned, the N that's in the soil. What's the recommendation then? Are most growers, doing tests where they know how much N they've got in the soil? Maybe start with you, Jo.
Look, I think some growers have a really good idea, of their farm and of their rotation. So they might not be testing every year, but they'll have a pretty good idea, hopefully, of what they're getting from their previous crop. So they might not be testing every year, but most of them will have hopefully a reasonable idea of what to expect from under their boots. And if you are going to do it, it is a really, really good idea, because it does give you an idea of how you can plan that mass balance a little bit more effectively and with more confidence. So again, it will depend on where you are in your rotation and what you are on your farm. It might not be every paddock. Is that a fair comment, Richard?
I think that's fair. From a ryegrass perspective, I don't think many would be testing close to closing, and would generally talk about mineral end testing being done near the end of winter. But actually, nitrogen from closing onwards is the key that we really need from all our grass seed crops, really. So actually knowing what's there at that point, because you've actually had September, August, most of September, and in some cases a lot of October for mineralisation to occur, and that's whether the plants have actually taken all that up or whether it's still available for them from at that point onwards. And so I think there's room to make improvements by testing out there. I guess this winter and the winter we've had with started off reasonably wet in most places and then been reasonably warm, we've had a lot of plant uptake of nitrogen. So there's very little in the soil, and is probably what most people are assuming. Yeah. But what's that going to be at the end of September, early October? And that's sort of the question that doing some testing at that point would help answer.
So how, if growers want to know more about this in more detail, where can they find out the information? Or, are you guys going out doing workshops? Joe.
So we are doing workshops in September and October, and we've also shared some of this information in our earlier workshops, which is available online. And some of this information around biological and total optimums, we're still building and working our way through lots of different crop types. So Richard and I have referenced feed wheat and it was perennial ryegrass.
Yes.
In this instance, so we're actually trying to build a better picture to give us more confidence around lots of different crops. So if you come along to our field walks in the coming weeks, we'll have hopefully have some information available on autumn barley and spring barley to help try and build some of those pictures. So come have a look online, have a look at Crop Action and Far Weekly, and come along to our events. We love to see growers and we love to see reps and we love to talk about this in the paddock.
Yes, absolutely, Richard.
I just want to add that, like, the discussion has to then go beyond just nitrogen as a standalone product because it influences so many other things. Yeah. So, like PGR programs, disease programs, they all have to be tied into it. So we've really just touched on nitrogen, but actually timing of nitrogen is really important in terms of driving the other inputs that you're going to need. So if you grow a large canopy, it's going to use more water. It's going to take more standing.
Right. Everything is interlinked.
It's interlinked.
Exactly.
You've got a greater humidity within the crop, which increases our risk of higher disease pressure. So all of these things interlink. And
those are the sort of things we can touch on in field. Growers can bring discussion points or scenarios to us, and we can talk about them in real time.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other comments that you'd like to make?
Actually, if you are interested in our aphid monitoring, we do have a network of paddocks that are up and down New Zealand. So have a look on our website. It will give you hopefully an indication of what the pressure is near you, and it can give you a prompt to get out and have a look in your paddock. And also, again, talk to your rep and encourage them to have a look at some of those things because, like we said at the beginning, this is the season to monitor.
Yeah.
And it's a season to talk, get ideas, and in some cases probably talk with your bank manager and make sure that everything's okay because you have to look after your mental health and that side of it as well because there's always going to be next year and you have to make sure that you can get through to next year.
Well, exactly. That's right. So it is very much hunkering down and not doing anything drastic because it's more likely to impact on yield than it is on your bottom line, which ultimately will impact on the bottom line. But it's about being out in your crop and making informed decisions. And utilising the expertise in FAR to help you make those decisions. Okay, great. Thank you very much, both of you. And thank you very much, listeners. Have a great day on the farm when we've just been talking about how difficult it is? I will. Have a great day on the farm.
Thanks for tuning in to Cut the Crop, presented to you by FAR. If you'd like to know more about any of the topics discussed or have any suggestions for future topics, go to www.cutthecrop.co.nz.